Beautiful Scarred Soul by Ohbear, Chapter 1. Sangwoo could recall the same familiar beat against his door every night for the past 3 years. It dragged, clicked, then thumped. Occasionally it would be given company by shrill screams and furious growls. His darkened vision occasionally flared red, and sometimes he could taste the red in his throat when the drumming stopped. Sangwoo was familiar with this dream. It had become his friend. Despite the same merciless agony it inflicted on him, he had named his friend rather fondly, and sometimes he'd coo out the syllables as if he were ready to make love to the word. It was named something he held close to his heart. The dream was named Regret. Tonight his friend was having fun. It was louder, raising in pitches and echoing in Sangwoo's ears, sending gelid shivers down the length of his spine and causing him to frantically shift under his blankets. It was too hot for these. Why were they here? An utterance of his distress escapes from him as he kicks the heat away from him, burying his face in the pillow to block out his friend's cry for him. Sangwoo could feel the plush surface beneath him phase from his sensation, and he slid his fingers breathlessly through the thick rivulets of crimson swarming around his body, as if his skin possessed the feed for the hungry beast he called his friend. How could he not? Regret never left his side. Regret kept him company in the coldest nights. Even in his distress, every night it returned, each time with a brand new surprise for him. This time it was blood, rushing against his body in violent waves, filling his lungs and nose when it became too much for his mouth to hold, occasionally spilling past his lips in thick, vicious streams. Sangwoo cried out, the fluid slipping between his teeth and gripping his tongue. His body was magnetic to the unforgiving beast. All at once it was gone. It vanished with a touch of frail hand against his cheek, and Onyx's eyes flitter open instantaneously at the touch. His gaze meets with that of his sparse company that he never considered as a friend, even after months of their living together. Bum. Sangwoo recalls his company's name, voice rumbling in its gravelly baritone. He refrains a scowl at the hand that fails to remove itself from his person, but soon Sangwoo becomes weak to the touch. He rubs against it. You were crying in your sleep. Bum's voice is always the same, shivering, tentative, obnoxiously weak. But at that moment it was all Sangwoo needed. Was I? I don't recall. Sangwoo can't help but flash a jaunting smile, ignoring the memory of his friend's visit, ignoring the blood that he swore he could taste on his tongue. Bum only smiled at him. It was an ugly smile, wasn't it? Curved at the edges, delicate and ready to be shattered. Rehearsed. Sangwoo couldn't care less. Not when he was grateful for the lack of response. The worry in Bum's brows was good enough answer for him. Sangwoo shifts, propping himself onto his elbow and using the other swipe across the scarred surface of Bum's jaw, beckoning him closer. He was almost smug at the obedience, deciding to reward it with a tender placement of his lips against the raven-haired man's nose. Sangwoo had taught his company an elusive language, conducted solely through vague shifts of the body. He himself had mastered the language years ago, where his movements chose if he could eat that night. Right now his body was asking for nothing but touch. Bum complied, shifting closer and resting his head atop Sangwoo's bicep. Bum's body spoke quietly, but Sangwoo was keen to pick up on it, his hands slowly grazing down the curve of his spine, tracing careful and thoughtless loops in the fabric of the sweater Bum had been clad in. Their touch was enough to help him come down from his shivering paranoia that the dream had inflicted upon him. Sangwoo had become uncomfortable with this comfortableness. His hand had eventually slipped under the hem of Bum's sweater. The familiar flinch from the aforementioned forced Sangwoo to roll his eyes in disbelief, shifting to rest his chin atop Bum's head while he massages the rough pads of his fingertips between the ridges of the other male's spine. Sangwoo knew how to touch. He knew how to make poetry with his hands. His silent words were rubbed into Bum's skin, sealing them away to stay forever, his calloused fingers trailing along the curvature of the company's ribs. Had he always been so slender, so fragile? Sangwoo could easily shatter his body in his arms. He could snap the neck that produced the warm breath wafting across his bare chest. He was capable of shattering every bone in the body that was pressed against him. It was almost cute, how Bum was so willing to bend to his needs, just like a flower bends to catch the sun's rays. A trivial thought, but one that sticks with him through his sleepless night that he had spent rubbing unsaid words into the canvas of Bum's back. The morning is dubbed as such the moment Sangwoo cannot bear the pinpoints of static on his bicep where Bum's head lays. Impatiently, Sangwoo maneuvers the pillow to take the place of his arm, before slipping away from the resting form, silently escorting himself out of the room. Being in Bum's company was too painful right now. Sangwoo knew that for a fact. Hours are spent in the early dawn with a cigarette tucked between his chapped lips. Sangwoo does nothing but watch the thick coils of smoke entangle in the early morning sky's dusty rose, his thumb periodically tapping off the gleaming embers. The silence was beautiful, and nothing but the distant sound of birds whistling and the faint breeze jingling the leaves of the bushes positioned in his yard. Was Bum awake yet? Sangwoo couldn't help but wonder, despite the deep ache situated atop his breastbone at the mere idea of the person. Sangwoo, out of sheer frustration, snuffs out his cigarette and stalks back into the house. An exhale of smoke tangling in the air and brushing against his face, his shoulders hunched and brows furrowed. He appears absolutely beastly with the limbs of smoke brisking along in a leisurely trail. It vanishes when he reaches the kitchen, and he's more than satisfied with himself with the lack of Bum's presence. His hands are aching for touch. His body is weeping for attention. Sangwoo can feel the strong muscles in his back flex as they become taut. The oncoming migraine promises its arrival with the tightening of his chest. His chest lusted for the pressure of Bum's head against it. What was wrong with him? It was his friend, Sangwoo decided. Regret never leaves his side, especially not in his moments of being alone. His friend tugs at his hand, beckons him to rest. It massages his shoulder and whispers words of lullabies in his ears, kissing his eyelids. Regret had a bittersweet way of rearing its head between his shoulder blades when he was walking away from it. A bittersweet way of pushing him down and drowning him in nothing but red. Sangwoo's hands are moving before he can tell them to. He's rushing around the kitchen, pulling out supplies from the pantry and refrigerator. There's too much in his head, yet too little he can show for it currently. Lips pursed and his rampant and haphazard breathing escapes through his nose in slow huffs. He's occupied in cracking an egg over a heated skillet, with tossing bacon alongside it and using another to evenly toast pieces of bread. The house is fragrant with his cooking, the smell strong enough to lure a sleepy man out of the bedroom. Bum had been limping, trembling on his feet and clinging to the wall for support when Sangwoo sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Sangwoo, unsurprised, finishes preparing the plate and sets it on the table, rushing over to the smaller male and wrapping a strong arm around his waist. They both look at one another with the same weak smiles, and Sangwoo can't help but chuckle out a low purr in amusement, Bum giggling soon after. Soon enough, they're both sitting across from one another at the table, Bum resting his chin on his folded hands and occasionally parting his lips for Sangwoo to tuck a mouth-watering bite of food between his teeth. One of Bum's hands lowers, thumping against the tablespoon and soon being covered in Sangwoo's larger palm. There was silence. With their gazes they held a seamless conversation. The food is gone, and there's nothing between them other than the table. Sangwoo dips his head, lost in his brooding black diamond eyes shimmering, as if they had a galaxy of secrets. Eyes that soon become dull with the vacancy of life mere seconds later. There's a solemn beauty of his face, dark brows drawn, lips pursed, jaw prominent in its state of clenching. His hands are pressed flush against Bum's pallid ones. Sangwoo's fingers are dipping around the others and clasping the small hands in his own. Their silence had become rigid. "Do you always have nightmares?" Sangwoo knew it wasn't meant maliciously. He could feel it was meant out of concern, and yet he could do nothing but feel the trim hairs on his nape stand at attention. He raises from the table, gaze dull and exhausted as he gazes down at Bum with a shrouded anger. And yet, he doesn't act upon his feelings. He allows for it to seep into his fingertips, to melt into his veins and allow for the heat of his anger to keep him awake. Even if Bum had wanted to, he had no chance to ask once more before Sangwoo was gone. Shuffling his shoes on and out of the door, coming to terms with his friend was proving to be more difficult than he had thought.